Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment
with Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and today we have a special guest, Rob Ciccone, because we
Hey.
have a special. Hey, everybody, say hi to Rob. Hey,
Hi, Rob.
And
Hi,
today's
audience.
special show because today we are going to talk about psychedelic rock, and Rob knows a lot about it. He is a musician. He does a lot of cover music as well, and this is way up his alley. But before we start the show, as always, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. We really want to know what you're thinking because that helps us shape the show. Randall, what's a good way to reach us if you want to
Check out our website, chrisandrandall.com. Check out our Facebook page, Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall. You can leave comments there.
Excellent. So, psychedelic rock. Rob, in fairness, a lot of our viewers are Gen Xers or boomers, but, you never know. There might be an 18-year-old, a very young millennial or Gen Y or Gen whatever's, who doesn't really know anything about psychedelic rock. So as if I had never, let's pretend I never heard of psychedelic rock. Tell me what it is, how it got its name, and how it came to be.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Randall. And here we go. Psychedelic rock was a very popular genre of rock music that had basically a 3 or 4 year heyday from 1966 to about late 68, about 1969, we'll say, was when it was a popular form of rock music where there were million selling, gold platinum records, singles, artists that helped shape the genre and bring it from its embryonic stages where there was folk, blues, country, jazz, rock influence, a melding and coming together of ideas that, because the name psychedelic is an offshoot of the fact that much of the music was influenced by LSD 20 lysergic acid usage. Specifically,
so that's 66, right?
Yes, 1966 is the time that the listening public got wind of the songs that had much trappings and affectations that would become known for
and
psychedelia.
66 is, Randall, that is when Timothy Leary starts dealing with LSD?
I'm not exact.
Timothy Leary. Sorry?
Go ahead, Rob, please.
Oh, I was going to say, Timothy Leary factors, Al Owsley, the Merry Pranksters. There's that whole period leading up to the popularity of the psychedelic music, where you had the acid tests in San Francisco. And it should be pointed out that there were two hotspots of psychedelic music's burgeoning scene in America: San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, which I've been to and visited, and you could tell to this day that something happened there years ago, and London, swinging London. These are the two places on earth where the vast majority of what we call psychedelic rock happened. Other places too, but mostly there.
So what were the key events in London and San Francisco that caused it to launch?
Good question. We'll start with San Francisco because we'll start with America. San Francisco, which I've been to once, and either you guys ever visited the city?
Yeah. I have.
We're in LA, so it's not that big.
But still, you've been there. So
right.
San Francisco, out of any place in America and even California, seems to have been. It has a history, of course. It has a wonderful history of all sorts of artists and people with differing viewpoints, politics, art, whatever. Then the rest. So it was the beatniks started in the 50s. There was the whole burgeoning, the Jack Kerouac people. I don't know. I wish I knew more about that and reread On the Road, but that's what helped start San Francisco by the 1964-65, you had the Warlocks, who became the Grateful Dead, who came in from San Rafael. You had certain bands Jefferson Airplane is a wonderful example. You had, by 1965, you had bands that went further than the folk rock of Bob Dylan and the Early Birds and the Beach Boys, and certainly anything from the early rock and roll era. The time around then, 64, 65, in that city, there was a developing of, a movement of people for whom things were changing. The Vietnam War had a lot to do, affected, as should be pointed out, between, I need to spend a little time on this. See, it's hard for anybody who didn't live through it to understand the cultural.
Well, how old are you, Rob?
If you don't mind
Rob's my age. Rob's my age.
So Rob, you're okay.
90.
So you and Chris are both 55. So how old were you in 68? You were
me?
Yeah.
I turned 2.
All right, so
I turned 2.
So this era is a little bit before your time, but you remember the music.
Listen, well, here's the thing. Because I don't remember the 60s other than like the very end of like 1969, Sesame Street and whatever. Obviously, I'm not one of those people that could lay claim to having been there at the time. However, through just cursory, just having been a fan of the music, and some of the films and the culture and the mythology, if you would, the romanticization of psychedelia and hippies. So the words we have to bring into the conversation if you're going to talk about psychedelic music. I've had such an interest in it that doing enough research and talking to people and even being in San Francisco in front of the Jefferson Airplane house outside of Golden Gate Park, I find it to be a very interesting.
Well, it definitely touches our life. Because
even if you didn't live during the time, you weren't born even,
right?
You could still feel that the music reverberates, and I mean literally.
So
especially
Rob,
if you've ever taken drugs like LSD, which I might have. I may
None
have.
of us are. I did acid. I've dropped mushrooms. I've done drugs.
Okay.
Well, I've actually done mushrooms, but not LSD.
Okay. Well, there we. Now none of us will ever get a job working for Disneyland. Thank you very much, Rob. You outed us all.
Well, Rob. So you think So you think that the music from this short, brief period, it was heavily influenced by the counterculture, which was people questioning the status quo in America, and kids taking LSD. Okay, and what other influence do you see? Like the baby boom, the hippies. Do you see any other influences?
Civil rights. It wasn't just college-age bourgeois white kids. You couldn't have had a Jimi Hendrix or Sly and the Family Stone. The Motown artists were writing more psychedelic stuff, psychedelic shack adaptations, which led to Papa Was a Rolling Stone. The affectations of what made psychedelic music, which I need to point out, the music had moved past just the natural amplified sounds of electric rock or pop soul music, where you just plug in the guitar, turn it up, turn the bass up, record. This was you had a whole period of explosive creativity in which.
Well, you just said something really interesting, and I just want to stop you for a sec.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So I feel like the key difference between folk music and the beginning of psychedelic rock, and please stop me if I'm wrong, is that folk music, which comes out of the 50s and 60s, is really a lot of acoustic bass guitar. And that
yes,
psychedelic rock is probably one of the earliest rock genres to not only feature electric guitar, but also keyboard and Moog. And I know you're an excellently talented keyboardist. Would it be fair to say that the thing that makes psychedelic separate from folk, even though it sounds to me like it has a very much a folk sensibility, is that it uses electronic music to provide the compositional elements of what otherwise would just have been done normally with simple folk instruments. Is that a fair?
Yeah, it's a very fair assessment. Folk music, by definition, is simple. Is the Weavers, the Seegers, the Pete Seeger, the Chad Mitchell Trio, Peter Paul and Mary. I mean, everyone knows Peter Paul and Mary.
Right, and actually Peter Paul and Mary is a good one because they're right under that zone.
That genre of music, folk music, is almost always acoustic guitar based. Maybe some light percussion here and there, but for the most part, what's very important is that the lyrics, the vocals and lyrics are more important, or at least as important as the music, and the music isn't supposed to get in the way or be that interesting or that complicated or anything. And of course, there was a ton of folk music that survives, and there's always going to be folk music will always be influential in coffee houses and open mics.
Yeah,
but it came to a point where people wanted, certain bands and artists needed to do more than that. There was a yearning for more expressive.
So what's like this?
Yeah, I want to ask one more question, please,
sure.
Chris, while we're still on this topic of Genesis, because there's another part of the Genesis. I've listened to a lot of psychedelic music from this era, this brief period. I think it's extraordinary. I think it's some of the best. It might be some of the best music I've ever heard. Okay, I really love that era, and I think another influence, Rob, and you could tell me what you think, is you still have at this time a lot of very skilled recording engineers. Like I can't remember which recording artist told this story. It might have been somebody in Pink Floyd that said that there was an era in music studios where all the recording engineers were literally the recording engineers. They were wearing white lab coats, and the musicians were not allowed to touch the equipment, and the artists were not allowed to touch the equipment. And they were like, they did math, and they had slide rules, and and so what you get in the psychedelic era is you have like all these like incredibly smart engineers who are still working in these studios. What do you think about that, Rob?
You were describing, I know exactly what you're talking about. What you have just described is, it was either Paul McCartney, it had to be Paul McCartney, the Beatles, who when they started at EMI Studios, it wasn't called Abbey Road till the name of the album, but okay, EMI Abbey Road Studios, right from the beginning, Love Me Do and you know, Please Please Me and all the original stuff. The engineers, who among them was Norman Smith, who eventually did Pink Floyd, wore lab coats. It's true. They were very, you know, proper and treated in such a manner as if to say, like, okay, your job is to, you know, record, whether it's the Beatles, whether it's the Peter Sellers comedy records, whatever. They showed up in uniform. It was a uniform essentially that identified them as recording engineers and gave them like a certain, you know, standing in.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I'm the engineer, you are the artist, and
because
they have to follow.
Yeah.
Rules as far as you only put the faders this way. You don't the VU, the voltage, whatever VU stands for, voltage units, whatever. You don't push the units into the red. You do what's on the paper, what's considered standard practice as per EMI as far as making recordings.
Yeah. So do you think, because when you
but there came a point where that had to change. Because
well, do you think
the inmates took over the asylum at that point.
Right. Well, do you think that was happening during the psychedelic era, or that happened before or after?
Yes, it was. It was gradually. In the case of the Beatles, not just them, but we'll talk about them because they're the most popular.
Well, before we get to the Beatles, I just want to.
Wait! I want him to answer, please, Chris. He was saying something really interesting.
We're getting to the Beatles, and I just
let me answer the
question.
question.
I just want to but you asked a question, and I had a question on that. So just hold on, man. We'll get to the Beatles in a moment. I just want to say, before we get to the Beatles, which is very important, is it fair to say that there are bands that were psychedelic rock bands? That's what they did. And bands that were rock bands that tried psychedelic music. And can you, just before we get to the Beatles, which is a band that clearly is a rock band that went into psychedelic and then went out, could you at least draw the distinction so our listeners can understand when we're talking about the difference between a psychedelic band and a rock band doing psychedelic music?
It's a bit of a tough question to answer, but I'll do my best to address it. And here's the answer. Because psychedelia is a genre that had its pinnacle, 1967 is the Summer of Love, June 6th, Summer of Love. What's that? The Monterey Pop concert, Sgt. Pepper. Because that is the pivotal apex of psychedelia wholesale. If you started a band before that, the chances are good you were just British Invasion, garage rock, whatever. You were not considered psychedelic as far as what you were known to do. Like the Who's a good example, the Beatles, the Animals, etc. However, if you started around 66, 67, the chances are good you were labeled that from the beginning, especially if that's how you came out formed. Pink Floyd is the perfect example. Piper at the Gates of Dawn, Sid Barrett. Jimi Hendrix Experience, although I mean, he really is an amalgam of blues and soul, but psychedelia. You heard Purple Haze and Foxy Lady, and you heard you knew that this is a real psychedelic, head trip of an experience from the start. So that's how I answer the question, because again, it depends on when you started and what you brought to the table as far as your recordings. Again, Beatles and I said The Who before, and whoever else.
So back to what Randall was saying.
Yeah, will you just let me ask the question again, Chris? Please, will you let him answer it? Okay, I'm going to ask again, and Chris, please let him answer it. Okay, so Rob,
Yes.
what the transition from artists running the asylum, artists being able to touch the actual controls in the recording studio, that transition, was it happening during the psychedelic era?
Yes.
Is that why psychedelic music is so interesting? Is one of the reasons?
Absolutely, because again, let me answer. Let me give you some real life.
Let him answer it, Chris, please.
Dude, I think you need to do fucking psychedelics. But I'm just trying to draw a distinction in your question, because where I'm getting lost, man, is, are there bands that are like, we're gonna start a psychedelic sound, or is it like, I'm Brian Wilson, I want to do some psychedelic music, I have the power, I'm Paul McCartney, I have the power, and I'm gonna do psychedelic music? Because it's not really one in the same.
Guys, okay, this is really to Chris more than Randall. As I said before, similar to disco and new wave and punk, these genres. Okay, I mentioned those because those are more our time. But remember, think of psychedelia as just a filter, it's just a distillation, a distortion, whatever, of rock music. That if you heard certain elements in the music, you probably would think it was psychedelia. Mellotrons, backwards cymbals, backwards guitar, heavy use of reverb, heavy use of flanging. Again, we can't use new musical examples, but I need to bring up Tomorrow Never Knows, the Beatles' last track on Revolver, because this really has to be, for anyone who doesn't know, any 18-year-old or anyone interested in experimentation and
what year
progression.
Is that?
August of 1966. And this needs to be pointed out. It has to be a little bit of a story here. And this addresses Randall's, the lab coat thing. Beatles start a new album, spring of 66. They get a new engineer called Jeff Emmerich, who you might have heard of. Jeff Emmerich factors very high into their psychedelic, creative peak years. He comes in with the lab coat, his first day on the job. He comes in, very first day in the job, and the first thing they work on is Tomorrow Never Knows. John Lennon has this crazy song that's going to require tape loops, multiple tape machines, sound effects that were never made before. And they come up with a recording that could not be played live. It would be impossible. It was all based on acid trips. This is all legendary Beatles stuff. He wanted the sound of 10,000 Tibetan monks chanting. I mean, in reality, they got seagulls. But the thing is, if the Beatles didn't have the supreme success that they had already by then, if they didn't and stopped, and we're about on the verge of stopping touring, but if they didn't have the success that they built up from the Beatlemania years, they wouldn't be able to become the auteurs. Mr. Martin, I want to put my hand on the fader. I want to be able to do this, because that would have been impossible in the beginning. A couple of years later, it became possible because Lennon, McCartney, they chose to be more assertive in their creative muse in the recording studio to be able to achieve a Tomorrow Never Knows, to be able to achieve a Strawberry Fields Forever. The lab coats were still on, but things were done changing.
And that would trigger someone like Brian Wilson, right, to do Pet Sounds.
The story with Brian Wilson, the Pet Sounds, briefly, is that he heard Rubber Soul, the American Rubber Soul, flipped in a good way, and wanted to create music that was better than the Beach Boys had done, which would have been California Girls and whatever they were doing up to then. And that's a whole different story. Brian Wilson, in terms of psychedelia, it's hard for me to pigeonhole it as such, but certainly there's enough musical, interesting elements in what he was doing on Pet Sounds that goes beyond the Beach Boys' traditional rock music. He practically created a different kind of a genre of music that appealed to psychedelia to a degree. The Beach Boys were a harder sell for the head psychedelic crowd. They didn't, because unfortunately, because the Smile album, which was after, never happened at the time. They had Good Vibrations, late 1966, big hit. After that was a March Through the Desert for the next God knows how many years.
Rob,
and that's, which is a sad story, because they went from Good Vibrations, which was like the beginning of what could have been this amazing period for them, to irrelevance the next year. They didn't get to play Monterey Pop. I don't think they were even invited. So talk about, not even in a year's time. That shows you how quickly things changed from 66 to 67.
Well, I've listened to a lot of psychedelic music, and one thing I've noticed is how much variety there seems to be in that brief span of time. I mean, you listen to this music, and some of it sounds like jazz, some of it sounds jazzy, some of it sounds like heavy metal, some of it sounds like ambient almost. I mean, it's an incredible period of experimentation in American music, and it seems to be influenced by everything that came before, and it seems to have influenced everything that came after. I mean, would you say that's fair to say?
For the most part, yes. There is, in that brief period of 1966, 67, 8, 60, well, in a bit of 69 even, because by then it was already, I wouldn't say it was dead by 69, but it was dying out. Things were changing, splintering into the more, back to basics.
I'm going to hold you off on 69 for a sec, because I don't want to get to the end that quickly. We've got more than enough time.
You want to stay,
you don't have to race. But if we've talked about the brand name rock artists who tried psychedelic sounds, who are the pure psychedelic bands that came about, and how did they come about? In other words, is it that I'm a young band and I hear the Beatles do Tomorrow Never Knows and I just want to do psychedelic music? Or am I just part of that Haight-Ashbury scene and I'm already doing psychedelic music, but I'm not getting the same popularity as the Beatles?
What you just described is the Grateful Dead.
Explain.
The Grateful Dead. It is impossible to have a discussion of psychedelic music and not mention Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead. It's impossible.
Well, tell us the early years because of the story.
The Grateful Dead started out as a band called the Warlocks, with Jerry Garcia, Bob Weir, Phil Lesh, and whoever. I think it was at least them for sure.
Yeah.
They were a jug band. They were kind of more of a focused jug band originally, who were influenced by folk music, banjo music, country, that sort of stuff. They may not even play electric instruments in 1964, when they first started. By 65, they became the Grateful Dead, which I forgot if it came out of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I forgot how that's the name. The name came from a psychedelic experience, because these guys did. They knew the Berry Pranksters. They knew the people on the bus, so to speak. There's that whole legend of.
Hey Rob, I'm glad you brought up the Grateful Dead, because there's another question I wanted to ask you. The Grateful Dead are also highly associated with LSD. What do you think? What do you think is the connection between LSD and psychedelic music?
I'll tell you.
Is this not a fair question? Oh, you got an answer. Okay, good.
I do have an answer. Yes. For anybody that's ever done psychedelics, it's supposed to be, and it is, a mind-expanding, mind-altering, reality-altering experience, which means, think of reality right now, the reality of the three of us. Randall, you're sitting in your home somewhere. Chris is sitting in his home. I'm sitting in my home, and my home is, objectively speaking, if you brought 10 people in here, you probably would there'd be 10 people seeing the same thing, hopefully, assuming they all have vision. Okay, there's this curtain, there's lights here, there's this keyboard, whatever. On no substance, nothing mentally altering your thoughts, your patterns, or what's going on in your brain. Assuming you're straight, you should be able to. 10 people should see pretty much the same thing. You drop acid. You wait until you peak. You're going to see anybody here who knows anything about it knows it is decidedly and deliberately causing you to have an experience that you cannot have when you're straight. Like which you can't have under any type of drug. Marijuana can't do it. Alcohol can't do it. Heroin, LSD is a unique.
So, are you saying that the music is the objective?
That influenced the music. It had to. Absolutely.
So, to use a word from everybody's high school English class, is the music the objective correlative of the experience? It's the objective correlative. It's that symbolic thing that just conveys in music what it is experientially. And I'm thinking to my mind, I think one of the most, and just had a revival because it was used in a movie trailer last year. But to my mind, like the most psychedelic, if I could only pick one song that I really think, in my opinion, and it's so on the nose that I consider the song that in my mind embodies everything you've said about psychedelic rock, it's White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane.
That's one of them. That is definitely one of the biggest psychedelic songs ever that anybody ever did. And it was, I think, it was influenced by Ravel's Bolero, in case you didn't know.
I didn't know that. And just so those of you who don't know the title, it's the one where they go ask Alice when she's right.
One pill makes you larger. That one. I can.
Yes.
That's all the copyright infringement we're going to do.
Hey Rob,
it was used in the Matrix trailer that just came out last year.
Is it? Okay. Perfectly. It's the same way Kate Bush is now in what's that? The Stranger Things. Doing. Just saying, it's nice. It's nice to see older music.
Talk about that song for a moment and how it relates to what you're saying.
White Rabbit?
Yeah, because that's it uses Ravel's Bolero, correct? But it equates a very famous child story, Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland, yes.
But at the same time, it has these very interesting instrumentations, right? What are the instruments in that song?
It's regular Jefferson Airplane bass guitar, Paul Kantner on guitar, Jorma Kaukonen. It's regular rock instruments, but it's what they're playing. It's how they're playing it.
How are
There's
they
not
playing
a whole lot of. Well, first of all, you have if I forgot the bass guitar, you have a bass line. You have an uncharacteristic rock, almost jazzy bass line that starts the song boom 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 boom, which is the bolero. So you're setting up a tone for something that isn't like straight ahead beat rock music. It's something different. It's almost jazzy. So that alone makes it different. And then you have this sort of, then Jorma Kaukonen comes in with his almost a tonal Eastern influence guitar line.
Yeah, it sounds
I'm not going to start explaining. I'm not going to.
But it has almost like a Middle Eastern quality, the tonality.
Right. What Jorma's playing after with Jack Caskey begins is a guitar line that you would almost expect a trumpeter or a jazz musician to do, not a rock musician. But Jorma was that kind of guitarist. And then Grace Slick comes in with these lyrics. One pill makes you larger, one makes you small. You're in for something interesting. Hear that. Later on, I don't know the lyrics verbatim.
And you've had some kind of mushroom.
A hookah smoking caterpillar.
Right.
That again, this is not Puff the Magic Dragon. This is like that might have been alluding to drugs. Jefferson Airplane's like, we are taking these drugs, and we hope you do too.
But that's my point. I mean that it
that's the funny thing is, then this was a top 10 single or 15. It was a charting single besides Somebody to Love, which was the other big hit of theirs.
But it's and Randall, I correct me if I'm wrong, but or Rob, when does stereo come to be?
Thank you. Stereo recording, and the records, tapes, whatever, broadcasts. Stereo started. It started in the 50s even, but that's long. That was long.
I mean, on a commercial level. On a commercial level.
Okay. In reality, probably by the late 60s. By 1969, for the most part, by Psychedelia's end, monophonic recordings were obsolete at that point. They stopped making them. The albums, the LPs, not the singles necessarily, but a full-length LP, you're not going to find, when you're record collectors are not going to find monophonic Led Zeppelin, Abbey Road, the Jefferson Airplane, Volunteers. If your record came out in 1969 and beyond, it's not in mono.
Right, but what year does White Rabbit come out?
So stereo takes off then in a big way.
So it's what, 67?
Well, it starts to take momentum by 66, 67 with Sgt. Pepper or Experience, the first album. But by 67, these albums that were still recorded in mono, but where stereo was getting.
So do you feel like psychedelia is the first popular rock music movement that kind of takes advantage of stereo?
Yes. Although I would actually, yes, I was going to sort of debate that because I'm thinking even Jimi Hendrix, who really took big advantage of the fact that there was 8-track or the recording with this, as it used to be pointed out, how when you had more than 2 tracks, more than 4, you had to pan them and put them in 2 different, in a left and right field. And by doing that, you could do all sorts of things you probably wouldn't have done if it was just one monophonic speaker. It would be, you would have more to play with. For me, I would argue, although this is not part of the conversation, I would argue that it took until Led Zeppelin's first album, Beyond, for stereo to really be a thing. Like, okay, this is how it's done. Everything before that was leading up to it, and
but like in the beginning of psychedelia,
psychedelia is both mono and stereo, but stereo was where I'm thinking certain examples like the first Pink Floyd album, certain Grateful Dead, where they were taking advantage of it, but they were doing things that you wouldn't be doing later on after the psychedelic era ended, like hard panning and
Well, just Rob,
swish.
Speaking about technology,
it's hard to explain this stuff, but sure.
No, I understand. Speaking of just technology, though, when we get into the 60s, I want to say the late 50s, 60s, isn't that like the era of like the more complicated home stereo systems? I mean, when would you say that like the real like home stereo nuts started to appear and started to produce like these incredible stereo systems?
Well, first of all, in the 50s, most people had a hi-fi, what we called hi-fi. Just ask your mother, father, or your grandparents. Maybe had those stereos in the living room, those giant pieces of furniture that also may have a television set inside. And it was a record changer, and maybe it was probably mono, and it probably just had like just basic speakers. And I mean, that's what you played your Sinatra and your Glenn Miller albums on, and your opera and your Broadway. It wasn't really until later. I'm saying the rock era fans was the Beatles, Stones, and all that. In the beginning of their existence, you probably had a simple record changer or something that wasn't really the stereo that you came to know, the Techniques, the Pioneers. That wasn't until like the early 70s, really. Late 60s, 70s is when I think by the time everything was on stereo and nothing was on mono, like I said, the first Led Zeppelin album, that's another conversation for another time, where that's like the first real true, this is how stereo should be, and for the rest of your life.
But I'm just saying, at the beginning of hi-fi and the beginning and the popularity of psychedelic rock, they do go hand in hand.
Yes. Right. The 60s, the mid to late 60s psychedelia is in tandem with the rise of stereo and the rise of album-oriented rock on the radio stations. That's another thing that needs to be touched upon. That what eventually was called progressive music, not progressive rock, but the idea of music that went past "I want to hold your hand," went past I got no I can't get no satisfaction, because within a year or two, things were changing rapidly. Think of the Who going from the early proto-punk of like my generation to I could see for miles in only 2 years, and that was psychedelic for them.
It's almost like an era where the technology and the aesthetics of the music, they're pushing each other, right, in a sort of a dance, pushing each other further along. I mean, would you say that's true, Rob?
Yes, it was definitely true. Also clothing, and also the clothing. I mean, you look at any rock band from 1967 or 68. People who wear the colorful outfits, like not tie dyes. That wasn't until later, but really, especially like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Look how they dressed back then.
Phosphorescence,
the real floral patterns. Just think,
Paisleys.
Paisley, yes, lots of Paisley.
Well, that is. I mean, there is a visual aesthetic to psychedelic. It's certainly worth talking about Carnaby Street in London, and
London.
There was that weird mixture where in England there was Paisley and these beautiful, not Vivienne Westwood, but I forgot her name, but they were boutique, very stylized, very tailored. But then in like San Francisco, it's just the opposite. It's just like all kind of like hippie wear.
Well, that's America for you. England is England, and so of course in London you were going to have the word dandy. I love that word. Where you look, you are dressed. Everybody's thin. Everybody's 25 years old. Everyone's 24, 25. It's an amazingly perfect time of one's life to do what they were doing, and to think that they could conquer the world with their music and with their culture and everything.
Yeah, it's just so weird. Because I do think about the fact that it seems like. And Randall, you know me, I can never escape the social criticism. But, and Randall, I don't know if you think this way too, but like, it feels like psychedelic rock in one sense, in England, is for rich kids with cool threads talking about how much fun it is to get high.
Is there some...
And then poor kids in San Francisco dressed like, villagers doing
hold
folk
on,
music.
I'm gonna burst your bubble, Chris. Okay, first of all,
Okay.
Grace Slick comes from a wealthy family. First of all,
I know where she's from.
Grace Slick comes from a wealthy family. The Grateful Dead, at least one or two of those
She's
members
from Tiburon, which is a very wealthy suburb of San Francisco, right behind the bay.
Right.
I've seen where he grew up.
Who grew up?
Grace Slick. She's from
Grace
Tiburon.
Slick, yeah, she comes from money. Money. So all her, revolutionary up against the wall motherfucker stuff is a pose, essentially.
But the point is that she's singing about politics, and other people are singing about tripping. And I'm just trying to figure out, is there a difference between like the almost a pre-punk aesthetic going on in some psychedelic rock?
Well, there is a transition. And again, it depends on what the timeline. 1967, there's still the whimsical attitude of trying to recapture your childhood, of the altered reality of thinking the world, of peace and love and beads and flowers and whatever. And then meanwhile, you have the Vietnam War and civil rights. Those two things are looming over America the whole time. Your number might come up, right? You ask anybody who was of draft age at the time. That's the music reflected for a lot of people, that brutal reality of what they may be facing. But that was later on when it got even worse after the Tet Offense, after Dr. King was shot, Robert Kennedy. And then I realize I'm coming to the end. This is why the music morphed.
Well, don't come to the end, because I really have a lot more questions, and so does Randall.
No, please, finish the thought. What were we going to say? This is why the music morphed into what?
This is why the psychedelic music had to morph into other genres that were reflective of waking up from the dream and waking up from the trip. Heavy metal, folk rock, the 70s folk rock, singer-songwriter James Taylor, Cat Stevens, and then Black Sabbath on the other end, Zeppelin, and progressive rock. All that stuff was going to happen after psychedelia ended. Because all those other artists were involved in psychedelia in one way or another. And then that party eventually kind of came to an end after Altamont, after, the Vietnam, after 69, I use Altamont as the end, because after you have this concert that was supposed to be California's answer to the Woodstock, and the guy gets killed and people get beat up, then you start realizing shit gets real at that point. Like, the world is not what you think it is. And you have to deal with the brutal reality of things like Hell's Angels and the war going on, and the fact that someday will have to grow up and move out of your parents' house.
Yeah.
If you were 17, 1969, to 19, 1969, it's like at some point, those people had to grow up and like the Steely Dan song,
but I want to get to that later on.
So, I'm sorry.
Just
back to what you want.
In the height of it for a moment, okay? Rob,
Yes.
You got to let go with the flow, especially because I'm dropping out every so often. So what is like the impact? They're popular. You talk about how it affects fashion. How does it affect the hippies? How does it affect the boomers? How does it affect the youth of America and England and the world when it's popular? What's its impact?
Well, first of all, the popular music world has never seen anything like that while it was happening. There was no precedence for it. Hearing early Pink Floyd, Hendrix, there's nothing in music. When you first heard that, there's nothing that sounded like that a year, 2, 3 before. So again, this is a guess. I wasn't there, but a guess based on all sorts of things I've read and people's experiences. The music left such a positive for those that remember it at the time when it was new to hear Purple Haze, White Rabbit, the Doors, whatever. To hear it for the first time, it seemed like the doors of your mind were opening up, like something new was happening. It wasn't just musical entertainment. You're going to listen to a 3-minute record and dance. So if there had to, for the people who were of age at the time, teenagers, 20-something, it had an effect that made you feel like you were going to change the world for the better. Because there was again, this is testimony that I've gotten from people who are now pushing 70. Like if you were born in the 50s, 1953, 54, and you came of age then, this music if you let it, affected your life in such in what was at the time a very positive or earth-shattering way. Again, nothing sounded like Sgt. Pepper when we first.
I think
we have no way to know how that felt because we didn't live at the time. So there's no way for us to know from firsthand experience what that would have felt like. Waiting for that album to come out, people lining up out the door, and going and like 20 people deep buying one record. Have you ever heard about that in your lifetime?
Well, I remember
a record store in the 80s and was anything like that, the phenomenon where like everyone's lining up for one record and they're walking out with the same Beatles record or whatever.
The only time I remember that happening in
your lifetime.
In my lifetime, the only time I remember happening was with Depeche Mode and the Depeche Mode riot in Los Angeles. I think you remember that, Rob. Do you know that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Anyway, but that's a different subject. But I do want to say, I do want to say, Rob, I do want to say, I just want to say that I didn't grow up listening to music from that era, psychedelic music, and when I listen to it today, I mean, I love it. I think it's even more cutting edge and more. I think it's even more progressive. How did I come to listen to it? Well, I think how did I come to listen to it? Well, I think it was.
Yeah. When did you first go like, oh, wow, I want to hear this music 1960, whatever. This is cool.
It was,
maybe
I think it was first. It was first through Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles.
Yes.
Because because I had friends that liked the Beatles, and I had friends that liked the Beatles. I had friends that liked everything but Sgt. Pepper. That's the kind of friends I grew up with, right? They liked the Beatles but not Sgt. Pepper. And I listened to Sgt. Pepper, and it was the opposite for me. It was the opposite for me, and then I got into psychedelic that way.
What was your like? Are you more like a new wave punk, like 80s? I mean, you're roughly the same age as us, right?
No, he's 10 years younger.
I'm 10 years younger. I grew up listening to like. I'm about 47, and I grew up listening to like heavy metal on MTV was big when I was growing up. I didn't like it that much though, but Nirvana came out and grunge, and I like that stuff.
Of course.
So Rob, name me the top three psychedelic bands of the psychedelic era. The top three. Be really clear. I'm not talking about rock bands. I'm talking about bands that did psychedelic rock. Who are the ones that we don't know about, who we should know about, who we should look up on Spotify or Pandora or SoundCloud? Who are the ones you should know? The essentials.
Well, the first one is Pink Floyd. I think
that we don't know. Correct.
Really? All right. Well, we don't Pink Floyd, so that's not really fun.
I'm pretty sure everyone.
I mentioned Vanilla Fudge before, or maybe I didn't mention it. That was before camera.
You didn't.
I mentioned Vanilla Fudge personally because this was a band that actually did they didn't write original material, unfortunately, but they did wonderful covers that were very psychedelic and almost progressive and even like hard rock at times. The vortex of the three, but they had a very psychedelic thing about them, and to interpret cover music. You Keep Me Hanging On, the Supremes, for instance. Some people know that was a hit, but apart from that, they have only about 4 or 5 albums, and they really kind of got
What's their
lost.
best album for psychedelic rock that they did?
The first one, simply titled Vanilla Fudge.
Okay, what other bands besides Vanilla Fudge would you recommend that, hey, I'd like to know more about good psychedelic rock?
The 13th Floor Elevator. The other one that I think has gotten over the years a lot more respect and accolades is the 13th Floor Elevators. Roky Erickson. He's not a household name to this day, but he's long been a critic's darling. He's long been, and that band has been long known for being the progeners. What's how you pronounce the word?
Progeny.
Carriers of the psychedelic. Right. They have long been known to be a psychedelic band straight out of Austin, Texas. And You're Gonna Miss Me is one of their songs, and I think that would be the closest thing to a hit, because they didn't really have a lot of airplay or anything, but they were pretty psychedelic for their day, and they've influenced all sorts of. There have been tribute albums to them. There's been, so I think that they're worth looking into, especially their first album, which is just simple. The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators is not an album a lot of people talk about, but except for their fans. So people should give them a shot. And especially that it came out of Texas, of all things, right? Not where you'd expect psychedelic music to come from. That's the other interesting thing. There's another one who's gotten a lot more traction and play over the years, but it's still not a household name. Love, Arthur Lee, Forever Changes. They made a psychedelic record without doing psychedelic stuff. It's all music. It's all orchestral flourishes and touches, more of what some people would call Baroque pop. Walk Away Renée by the Left Banke. Don't Walk Away is one of the best Baroque pop or Never Mind.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I got to stop you right there. Hello. No, you don't have to cut. I met the man responsible for producing that song and getting it on the radio.
What song?
And the very quickest thing I can tell you about the Left Banke and Don't Walk Away Renée,
yeah,
because he was responsible for all their success, is they were so crazy and they were so self-destructive. They did a very big gig when they were #1 in England. The audience kept on shouting for them to come back. They did not do an encore. They were obnoxious to the press. And he said, as they were at #1, and in less than a month, they were so self-destructive, they completely imploded, never to be worked again. And that is why you never hear the Left Banke. I was amazing. He literally said he had worked for like 40 years in the business, and he said that was the worst experience of his career. No one wanted to work with them again.
I would never have thought Left Banke.
Now, that's not to take away anything from what you said about psychedelia, but hey, if I have something to add, I will. So what are the quintessential, like, here are the psychedelic albums everyone should know?
How many do I get to cite? 5?
Name some.
I'm not going to name them in order of appearance or order. I think I'm going to name 5 that I think if somebody lands on Earth, bring me to your psychedelic albums. I want 5 damn, great examples of this thing called psychedelic music. I'm going to hand you these 5 albums.
Okay.
Jimi Hendrix Experience. Are you experienced? Which will also be the same answer I would give if you asked me about guitar albums. But for psychedelic, Are You Experienced is 1. Pink Floyd, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, the British version that begins with Astronomy Domini. The American one was different, but first Pink Floyd album, you're getting that one. You're getting that. Now it gets a little confusing because albums, not just singles, albums. The Beatles, Magical Mystery Tour, not so. Why? Strawberry Fields Forever, and I'm the Walrus. That and All You Need Is Love, and Penny Lane, and George Harrison's Blue Jay Way. That would be the more psychedelic of beside that and Sgt. Pepper. And you're getting Magical Mystery Tour. Strange I would say that, but that's the one you're getting, just for that reason. That's 3. Okay, wait. I guess this is getting tougher as far as albums. Jefferson Airplane, After Bathing at Baxter's, is one of the most psychedelic albums there ever could be. No hits on it, no real big, no White Rabbits, no Somebody to Love, just a lot of psychedelia at their most craziest, trippiest. That's 4, right?
Yeah, 4. So what else? Do you have another one?
I'm thinking of one. It's just hard. I want to think of one that that not to stump you, but just to think, psychedelic. I said Beatles, Floyd, Hendrix.
Pet Sounds.
It's getting tough. No, Pet Sounds. I don't even consider psychedelic really. I consider that something better. That goes into a different category.
Well, I just want to say.
Okay, this is going to be.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have an answer. The Grateful Dead's Live Dead album. I'm going to have to. The reason is that the Grateful Dead. I know people love them or hate them. I love them. Their live albums, in some cases, are as iconic as their studio. They were iconic for the live concerts to begin with, but certain live albums they had, especially that one, captured something that could not happen in the studio in any way, shape, or form. There are Grateful Dead studio records that I would have voted for, Oxa Moxa or Anthem of the Sun. Live Dead is the one, just for Dark Star. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, put it on. You'll thank me later, or maybe you'll hate me. I don't know.
Well,
let's go. Those are the 5, I think, nearly indispensable. You must own these 5 psychedelic rock albums of the era.
Well, I just want to say, when I try to listen to psychedelic music, the way I find it is mostly YouTube playlists, like playlists people put together on YouTube, because There doesn't seem to be a good. I mean, it doesn't seem to be an actual genre. Like you can't go to Pandora and like type it in. I mean, I know you gentlemen told me before the show you could find it like on iTunes or something, but I don't have iTunes. But
well, no, iTunes has it as a when you put your CDs in to rip and make MP3s out of. You could pick the genre of music that you believe the album is. If you don't agree with what it comes up as an automatic choice from ID3 tags, whatever they're called.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a genre of music that shows up as a choice that you could tag your song at, your track. Now, as far as Pandora and Amazon, the rest of them, some of them may, some of them don't. I don't even know, honestly.
Well, Pandora does.
60s. By the way, I never.
You're a musician. I'm going to ask you a totally different question. You're a musician, and you play in cover bands.
Yes.
Your keyboard is your forte.
So they tell me.
I'm assuming you've played psychedelic covers, right?
Not a lot.
But the ones that you have done, what do you find the most rewarding, and what do you find the most challenging as a musician?
Light My Fire by The Doors. I'll tell you what, that one always comes to mind. First of all, it's an enormously popular song. It's a popular rock 60s song to begin with. It's in its purest form. It's 7 minutes. It's a 7-minute song. I mean, on its album version that we've heard on the radio a million times, and it has elements of psychedelia, but in fact, it has a sort of like jazzy thing to it that means you have to be able to have the musical skill. It's not just you're not relying on reverb or trickery. You're relying on your own musicianship. This is the thing that separated progressive rock and other forms from psychedelia. So Doors song.
What about the band Cream? What do you think about? Are they psychedelic?
Their album covers were certainly their music at times touched upon psychedelia, but they were too rooted in the blues and like jamming blues for me to really think they fell into the category because they existed in 1967, 68. So they did. I mean, Jack Bruce especially.
I think there's a lot of blues influence in psychedelic music.
There is. A lot of the best of psychedelic jamming involves blues changes and of course the Jefferson Airplane and later on Santana. I never mentioned them because they came a little bit later, but they still got lumped into psychedelia because they played Woodstock and that was still considered. But between the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Cream, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, to a certain degree Buffalo Springfield because you had Neil Young. These were bands that, of course, were blues-based. That had blues.
Well, Rob, another thing,
but they had other things too going on to make them different than just the Cream. Because of Clapton, he tried to keep it as heavy blues-based as possible. It was the other two that brought it into different weird directions.
Well, Rob,
look at the lyrics. They're trippy as beyond hell.
Rob, you brought up earlier that. Well, I think we agree that jazz had some influence on psychedelic music, and
most definitely it did.
There was some improvisation in the studio, perhaps in recording. Do you think there was a lot of improvisation in the psychedelic recordings from the era? Yes. Okay.
Light My Fire. Yes, there had to be.
So then people like Charles Mingus and John Coltrane, and Miles Davis, and that 50s, early 60s progressive jazz sound is really kind of working its influence on them.
Yes, basically, there was a time if you were jazz, you were jazz. You were rock, you were rock, and there wasn't a fusion yet. That's another time for another story. So basically, like a Miles Davis, who did Sketches of Spain and Kind of Blue, and and other stuff throughout, influenced Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, and so on, et cetera, et cetera. Carl Santana, of course, and so. You had the rock musicians who didn't have jazz credentials wanting to play music that sounded something like that with an improvisational, go for broke, but still retaining the beat and the aesthetics of rock. And
like,
Miles Davis
who was the drummer for the Doors?
What's that?
Who was the drummer for the Doors again?
John Densmore.
The Doors drummer. Right. Didn't he ever sometimes use just... Didn't he sometimes just use like a jazz approach on the drums?
Break On Through is a samba. The very first Doors thing you hear on the first album, the drums that begin Break On Through is a samba.
What is
the man had a jazz background. The man had a jazz background. Robbie Krieger had blues bottleneck. Ray Manzarek had the classical. Jim Morrison was the poet. That should have failed. those four guys should not have succeeded.
Right, and that's a good example. That's a good example of psychedelia, right? Because of the fusion.
The fusion of what the Doors did is really, as I've always said, 4 points on a diamond or something. Like you couldn't. I know the other three weren't as sexy, so Jim Morrison was the big sex symbol, but in reality, you have four people that you couldn't have had any other people on Earth be the Doors. Like you could, you think another guitar besides Robbie Krieger, who knows? But those four brought wildly divergent influences and made something that actually is still listenable to this day, strangely enough. And
so
I find
they couldn't. It should have been fictional, but as we know, it was a real band, and you all know from Santa Monica and where they all met, and it's legendary.
Rob, I find the music from that era just so challenging, so challenging and complex. Just so much more interesting than music that comes after. I mean, am I wrong to say that?
Well, no, you're not wrong. I mean, the only thing I would challenge you on is because I'm a big progressive rock fan. That's Yes, Genesis. That music, which I'd like to do a podcast on some other day of progressive rock, if you want me to, because I know more about that. I've actually,
I promise.
Okay, if you want. What I'm saying is, the psychedelic era is basically the begins of what was later going to be progressive rock and metal and.
Well, now that we're getting to the end, as long as you tell me why His Satanic Majesties is such a crap album, and not everybody who went to psychedelic land did a good job. Four Seasons, a lot of bands tried it and they crashed.
Okay, the Rolling Stones will be the one I talk about. We all know the Rolling Stones story. We all know what they're good at doing. We all know Keith Richards is really 200 years old, I'm saying, but the Rolling Stones, we all know, are at the heart of what they do is a tough meat and potatoes blues-based band. No matter what other things they've touched upon, reggae, disco, country, they are America's greatest rock. They're the greatest rock and roll band of all time, arguably. Or one time they were, and for good reason. When they were doing Brown Sugar and Jumpin' Jack Flash and all the stuff that we know them for. Because they passed through 1967, guess what happened? They heard Sgt. Pepper too. They heard Strawberry Fields, and Mick Jagger really wanted, he competed. He was the one of the band that really, and Brian Jones, when he was, sane, wanted to compete against the Beatles and do creative, important statement music, and because you had Keith Richards and the other guys, Satanic Majesty's Request has some interesting moments on it. It does. 2,000 Light Years from Home, I still think is a good slice of psychedelia. She's a Rainbow.
That's a good song. She's a Rainbow is a great song.
Right, She's a Rainbow is a good song. The problem is
it's just not a psychedelic song.
Well, it's of its time. It sounds like 67. It sounds like what they were going to do after Ruby Tuesday. Let's spend the night together. They were going to move in that direction.
It's more that Ruby Tuesday sound, though. It's more of a light pop song.
Right. The Rolling Stones.
So not everybody, and Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons.
Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons had an album called the Real Life Gazette something. There were certain artists that were not meant to do psychedelic or anything other than their original formula sound. I know that what's his face? Even Tony Bennett did a psychedelic record of all, the Now Sounds of '69 or something. It was like absurd.
And then on the positive side, you have the musical Hair, which also borrows psychedelic music in Broadway show tunes. You know we were going to do Broadway show tunes, guys. You knew it, right? I'm on this show.
Well, yeah, okay, Hair. Yeah, I know. Hair has to factor into psychedelics history. 1968.
Right.
It has.
I love the Hair soundtrack. By the way, that's. I think I listened to that too as a kid, and that may have been the first thing I listened to, and I didn't know it was psychedelic, but I loved it.
Later on, and a year or two later, Jesus Christ Superstar.
Right, so you've got songs like one of the songs I remember is Dawning of the Age of Aquarius, but there's more psychedelic sounding stuff on that Hair musical. So even on Broadway by 70, you actually have a rock musical that is using psychedelic influences.
That's not surprising because Broadway wants to be current and relevant too at times.
Do you think there's something very theatrical in the psychedelic sound?
There can be. I mean, it's not.
It's more like operatic or bombastic or just fuller. There's more.
The guys that wrote Hair. What was their names again? Jerry McDermott. He was
my next door neighbor when I was a kid.
I'll look it up.
Yeah.
Oh well. You're showing your privilege. Okay. Anyway, the point is the Hair soundtrack. The Hair soundtrack was written by guys who were probably in their 30s at the time, right? They were these Broadway guys that were in touch with what was going on in the pop and rock world, and probably felt it was time to write a musical. I mean, 1968 is when it came out, so it made perfect sense. And there was an audience. There was enough of a young audience that would dig it. Dig it was like overused, that phrase. You can't even say that anymore. And that's why, it's why it made sense for it to come out at that time. And then Jesus Christ Superstar a couple years later, but that was another story. Not so much like
or even Godspell. Godspell. You are right. There is, and now we can get to the end. We can get to the fall. So tell us about the fall of psychedelic rock.
Well, end. LSD was outlawed in '68, I believe.
66. It was outlawed even before Summer of Love.
Well, in some states it was outlawed, but I think federally it was outlawed finally in '68.
By '68 it was outlawed. But even putting that aside, even the legal aspect, things run their course, as we all know, right? So you have a genre of music that rises with Beatles Revolver, Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper, The Doors, all these new bands that came out in '67, and the Summer of Love, and everything. And it looks like the world is going to, the young people are going to take over the world. Everything's going to be great. And I would have loved to have been at the first Be in Central Park, like in '67, or Golden Gate, the Golden Gate one, because you have to figure they had to start somewhere. It had to be this time when all the young people got together and painted their face and and dropped acid, and everything must have seemed like we were going to go back to the Garden of Eden or whatever. Right? That's what people were trying to do, I guess. But in a couple of years, reality sets in. Dr. King being shot in '68 had started the downfall. I said it because that the racial harmony and that all but killed it. Although there's an argument to be made against it, but I think that had something to do with it. The Woodstock Festival in August '69, which really was like probably the last big psychedelic hippie party that was successful. That in spite of the rain and the mud and all the craziness, there's legend and mythology and romanticism about Woodstock by everybody that has never been there, not by the people that were there, by the people who has never set foot in Bethel, New York. I met people that were there, and they couldn't stay after a day or two because there were no bathrooms, there was no food, there was nothing. It was a disaster. But man, there's Country Joe in the Fist with the fuck cheer, and there's Joe Cocker, man, you can imagine. And Altamont.
Well, was it also just, is it that there was now acid rock, there was country rock, there was
acid rock? Hold on. You mentioned acid rock, which I forgot to say the words. Acid rock was more of what the Americans called it. Psychedelia was much more the British called it at the time.
But when did Led Zeppelin and the harder rock stuff start coming in around the end of '69?
Zeppelin, a couple of things that helped put psychedelic to bed was, I think, enough people stopped doing acid, moved on to cocaine and heroin, the harder people, and some people just decided not to do drugs at all and just live normal, comfortable lives.
All right, but I think it's '69, '70 when Led Zeppelin knocks the Beatles
Zeppelin
off
comes out
the
in
English
69.
So they knocked the Beatles off the charts in England.
That was Zeppelin 2, Whole Lotta Love, that knocked Abbey Road off the top spot. So that shows.
So now that's the sound that really
rock, the young kids. Well, a couple of things happened, Chris. If you were under the age of 21 and you were in a record store and you were a middle class white kid, American mostly, Led Zeppelin by the second album, late '69, that was your band. That was becoming your band. Because they took what Cream and Vanilla Fudge and Steppenwolf and some other bands like that were doing and just made it better. And the Jeff Beck group, they took what already was there and made it better and made it much more desirable.
Rob,
and forged the type of music.
Rob, there was a question.
And it was all stereo, no more mono.
There was a question I wanted to ask that you kind of touched on. Do you think, because now we're talking about people moving on from it, do you think the audience had a lot to do with it? Because I feel like this is a generation, the baby boom, they grow up with a lot of wealth, they're well educated. Of course, they're a large group of people, so there's probably a lot of smart people, a lot of sophisticated people. Do you think they have the baby boomers? And I hate to say good things about baby boomers, but do you think they had more sophisticated tastes than probably any other generation? And so when they got too old to be into music, maybe that's sort of when it starts to die out.
Randall, okay. Very excellent question, Randall. You are an amazing interviewer. because you're asking questions that make me think, and I want to give you useful answers that make me
Excellent
look like
stall.
I have a
You're an excellent interviewee. That's how you stall, man. Compliment the question.
Randall. Okay, thank you, Chris.
I'm buying you time.
Thank you. I realize you told me when to stop. I don't have work tomorrow. I can go on all the live one night. You can't, and I'm tired too. But not that tired.
For those of you following at home, it's past midnight in New York City where Rob is. So he's burning midnight.
Ready to go. Randall's question was about did the people who listened to the psychedelic, whatever, did they get too sophisticated? What was your question again, Randall, about the movie?
Well, I feel like you're talking about a lot of things come together to make the psychedelic era. And I think one of the things that happened was you had a very sophisticated audience, and the audience was sophisticated because they're baby boomers, they come from wealth, there's a lot of them. I mean, I think I've read statistics. They're the baby boomers were the most educated generation of any generation. I mean, part of that is they're trying to dodge the draft. But go ahead, please.
Okay. The baby boomers are what year to what year birth? What's the
1945 to 1965, but not the 1965 that I'm a member of.
Okay, but here's the thing: if you were born, would it be fairer to say more of the late boomers born in the 50s? The reason I'm saying that is because if you're born in 45, by 65 you're 20.
Correct.
Of the okay.
Randall is a good example because Randall's born in the middle of Gen X. So you're saying if you were born in the middle in 55, Randall, you were born in 75. Boy, you're going to learn so much about us. So yeah, that person
the thing is,
who would be 20 and 75.
Mr. Randall, I know people who were born in 1954, 55, mid 50s. They're baby boomers, but they're later boomers. They're about 10 or 12 years older than you and me, Chris. So these are people that remember the Beatles and Sullivan, they remember JFK being shot, they remember the whole 60s as young kids who eventually became teenagers by the end of the 70s. And they know people who are a little bit older. So these are the people I'm focusing on who really lapped up the psychedelic rock. You teenagers, 20-something. But the thing is, I'll say this to Randall, it depends on how old you were. So we'll say, for argument's sake, you were a teenager in 1967, and 2 years later, you went up to Woodstock or would try to go, and you were about 19, like Jackson Brown's age or Tom Petty's. All those guys roughly born about the same time. Bruce Springsteen, 1940, 53, whatever the year is. By the early 70s, by 70 even, 69, 70, the cultural climate moved past psychedelia. People, Jimi Hendrix died in 70. Janis Joplin died. That had something to do with it, by the way. That was like when Kurt Cobain died, how grunge almost died. So yeah, Jimi Hendrix's death in 1970, September of 70. Janis Joplin, October 70. Brian Jones, to a lesser degree, who died in summer of 69. But Joplin, Morrison, Hendrix, then Janis Joplin dying. We didn't talk about Janis Joplin, 1970, and then Jim Morrison a year later. I wouldn't say killed psychedelia, but it kind of it put an end to things. They kind of and Altamont, the concert the Rolling Stones concert where people got beat up and there's a real ugly event that just showed you that the 60s were coming to an end, the dream and the myth and all that stuff. And the music that went forward reflected the divergent prevailing winds and attitudes. The soft rock of James Taylor couldn't have existed.
Right. But also, if you think about it,
Stevens, Paul Simon is a solo artist.
But you're also forgetting something. I think that's very
away from the craziness and
key
in your more normal music, folk-based, simple-based, song-based music again.
Key in your analysis, and you're not really mentioning this, but I'm going to give you the opportunity to do so because you pointed out that England and America are driving psychedelic rock. And what you have in the beginning of, in London in the early 70s is not just hard rock and Led Zepp, but you're also getting what is like...
You're getting
prog, which is in a way, when it would say, it's kind of like where psychedelic rock was and then goes to the next level.
It totally... That's for another show, but I won't.
No, but can you at least draw the line that psychedelic rock gives the foundation for...
Okay, in London, two significant bands helped bring the world away from psychedelia. One was Led Zeppelin with the first album, second album, going in a much more hard rock direction with touches of psychedelia, but mostly hard rock. The other was King Crimson with Court of the Crimson King. as the first known progressive rock album. They had lots of hints of psychedelia, but they moved musically past. They did what the Moody Blues couldn't do, what the Beatles couldn't. I mean, it's just in terms of musical skill and execution that became known as hallmarks of progressive rock that started nowhere in the world other than London, because they had the right people, the right time, the right confluence of musicianship and willingness to do, and ability to do what those guys did. And that's why that happened there. You also
Genesis is another band that I would think.
Genesis is among them. Absolutely, they are.
So you have on one hand, in England, you've got this beautiful thing coming out of the more melodic, complex structures that makes psychedelic. But then in America, in New York City, you know where I'm headed, and in San Francisco, you've got the Velvet Underground, which started out kind of in a psychedelic way, and then you've got MC5.
In Detroit, I didn't mention the Velvet Underground for a reason. I should have, but I didn't. You know why? Because they're like what I call psychedelic adjacent. To me, I didn't mention New York City this whole time. You know why? Because to me, New York didn't have a really amazing, worthy music scene until the CBGB's punk era. That is legendary. I don't know. Now, again, there was the folk scene in the Greenwich Village in the 60s, but for psychedelia, New York City didn't produce a lot of it. There's not a whole lot of rock bands from the late 60s that came out of New York that I would think really are that, iconic.
Rob, you're touching on something else. I actually was
a notable exception. They're a notable exception, but there's something totally different. That, but as far as like what they've influenced and who they've affected on the world, as far as Lou Reed and everything. That's a whole, I think Lou Reed, if he was here, would probably not want to be associated with psychedelia or progressive anything. At least not openly, because this punk is not so punk and real, to the street attitude doesn't jive with bourgeois, progressive and flower. But he was of that. He came from that background, right? He's from Long Island, isn't he?
Yeah, I think he is.
I'm back. So I don't know if I don't want to interrupt you, but I'm just saying, I really believe if you look at the Stooges, you look at MC5, and you do look at the Velvet Underground. And you do look at New York in that same era of history, getting into the late 60s, the Hotel Chelsea, and Detroit, sorry, didn't mean to say San Francisco. You can also see how psychedelic rock not only gives birth to prog rock, but I'm going to argue it also gives birth on some level to the American punk rock scene or proto-punk scene.
It's very possible. Yes, there's something to be said about that, although I think that the MC... You see, this is the thing. The Velvets do have a psychedelic. They have songs that went on forever, Vis and Furs and all that. But the other bands, I'm wondering if they owe more of their aesthetic to garage, like the Standells, Dirty Water, stuff like that. The mid '60s garage music.
But there is stuff on those early Stooges albums that's pretty psychedelic.
Yes, there are definitely like a 9-minute song. If any of your rock songs are 9 minutes. You are either a progressive rock band or you're like the MC5 or the Stooges jamming and droning.
Right. So I will say
the Doors did on the end.
Psychedelic rock makes white noise more than white noise. So that when you get to the Velvet Underground in America, you get to the Stooges, you get to the MC5,
and eventually they're borrowing.
Right. You're borrowing.
They themselves were psychedelic at one point. I mean,
true.
Later.
But they're borrowing what psychedelic has established, which is almost an atonality and a distortion and a garage sound.
Yes.
And they're taking it they're taking that folk sensibility that we talked about at the beginning, and they're elevating it into another direction that will eventually give birth to the American punk scene.
Yes. Which then gives birth to the new wave scene. But
Rob,
I mean, basically.
Well, there was something I wanted to ask that we're touching on now is another factor I think that went into the psychedelic era. We're talking about those few brief years is there seemed to be a lot of really good musicians around, and a lot of when I listen to psychedelic music, I can hear the virtuosity in the playing, and I mean
some of that. I'm sorry, finish the question. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, I mean, do you agree with that?
To a degree, I'll tell you what. Yes, it depends on the record you're listening to and which bands. Jefferson Airplane just had Jorma Kaukonen on lead guitar. That alone meant you had a great, skilled guitarist rooted in blues, jazz, classical. The other members of the band were not slouches. But he alone, you go. There's a track called "Embryonic Journey" that's on the Surrealistic Pillow album. It's 2 minutes of just beautiful piece of music that Michael Hedges would have listened to when he was a kid. Go, wow, I want to be like that when I grow up. Michael Hedges is an acoustic guitarist on the Windham Hill label. Just that's another story another time. So yeah, he was a virtuoso on his instrument. Jerry Garcia and Bob Weir on guitar are significantly better than most people. They're not usually cited in Guitar Hero. Jimmy Page, Clapton, Eddie Van Halen. I can understand that, but make no mistake. They were exceptionally skilled musicians who happened to be originally psychedelia, jam rock, whatever. They and Phil Lesh, the rest of them too, but mostly those two guitarists, I would call them pretty much close to virtuoso, highly skilled musicians.
I just see this era, the psychedelic era, is just like all these factors come together. All these
songwriting too.
Songwriting, yeah. I mean, all these factors come together. All this talent, the engineers, the studio engineers, the people taking LSD, like you already mentioned.
The record labels. We didn't mention Frank Zappa. I should have. Again, who wasn't. I thought
Mothers, Frank Zappa, and the Mothers.
Freak out. Frank Zappa pointed out in it's 1960 whatever, one of his interviews, how this, like the guys, the fat guys smoking the cigars in the suits took chances on some of these bands. They took chances on the Pink Floyds and Grateful Dead.
Why do you think they're willing?
They had the 40-year-old men, the people who were like twice the age of the bands, who were still listening to Tony Bennett, big band music, Elvis, didn't know what was going. They didn't really have understanding what the fuck was going on. But someone like a Clive Davis, who has a great documentary. I mean, the man signed Santana twice in his life.
Why were they willing to take the chances at that time?
Because number one, they had the money, they had the resources to do. The world was not as expensive a place as it is now. They had the resources, they had the willingness. They got the older guys who in their 40s, the suits, the jackets and the cigars, sensed that rock music was selling in numbers. The Monterey by Woodstock, they saw 500,000 people in one place listening to rock music. That was, the lights all went off then. If it didn't go off by then, that's when it went off. Bill Graham, the man who gave us the Fillmore East.
The last question of the show.
Live bands, okay, psychedelic.
The last question, because we're wrapping up. Nate, tell us what at least one of your favorite psychedelic songs is and why.
Tomorrow Never Knows, the Beatles.
And explain why.
Maybe I already mentioned that. Should I mention that?
You already mentioned it, so mention another one.
Ooh, give me a second. I'm going to come up with something. It's going to be I'm the Walrus.
Okay, why I Am the Walrus is your favorite psychedelic song?
But it's not my favorite. It's one of them.
No, give me another. The Beatles aren't really a psychedelic band. Give me like something.
But they were.
Yeah, but it's not a super trippy song. I'm the Walrus. Come on. You can do better. You can do better.
Okay, I'm gonna think of another one. Give me a second. I'll go for. I wouldn't call it low hanging fruit. Pink Floyd's Astronomy Domine.
Okay, that's a great song and it's super psychedelic. Most people don't know it, but if you want to look it up, it's would you even spell it? Astronomy.
The word astronomy, and Domine is spelled Domine. It is the first track on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. It is also a live version on Umagoma. There's a live version on Pulse from the 90s. David Gilmour revived it for Pink Floyd in the 1994.
And what is so special about this song as an example of good psychedelic rock?
Both the studio version, which is 4 minutes, and the live version from Umagoma, which is more people know, it has very trippy, spacey lyrics. It has a driving beat that's still. It's not heavy metal like driving beat. It's kind of it's hard to describe this. It's really hard to describe it. It just has a particular air about it that brings you to the place where they're singing about Jupiter and Saturn and whatever. The music brings you to where they want you to go lyrically.
All right, and so it's transported. It's transported.
I can't get into the mechanics of like the chromatic. There's chromatic runs. There are certain musical things that Pink Floyd is doing that makes me think that they were not the band didn't have a virtuoso until David Gilmour. So it's Syd Barrett playing guitar. Syd Barrett, who wrote some of the best psychedelic songs of his time, 67, 68, was not an incredibly skilled guitarist, but he was spirited. and he had a lot of psychedelic soul to him.
What do you mean by chromatic? I'm sorry, I don't know that term.
Chromatic is where you're playing series of notes that are like next to each other on the keyboard, like half steps from half steps. I would show you on the keyboard. It's hard for me. That's the best way I can explain it. You're playing a G to a G sharp to an A to a B flat. You're playing a series of notes moving in half steps. For the music theory majors, if you happen to play piano or keyboard or guitar, you know what I'm talking about. And that creates a certain sonic effect when you do it in the right places to bring you either up or down. It's hard. It's the best way I can explain that. And so in that song, you have a series of chord changes that are basically uncharacteristic for rock music up until that point. And remember, the drug experimentation led to the music experimentation, led to the composition and the playing to lead bands like Pink Floyd and others in directions they would never have otherwise taken had they not done the drugs or had been around a culture that was that permissive and experimental for its time. And that's why the music largely moved in such weird, interesting, colorful directions.
Awesome, man. Randall, do you have a last question for Rob?
No, Chris, I'm good.
All right. Well,
that was wonderful. I just want to say thank you, Rob. That was really great. I loved listening to you talk about this.
We're going to let you go to bed, Rob, now, but man, we're definitely having you back. And I just want to thank everybody for listening or watching. I want to thank Rob for sharing his wisdom. I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
That's Rob.
And I'm Robert.
We'll talk later. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you, guys.